Ladies and gentlemen, imagine for a moment that you are holding a piece of broken pottery, shattered, fractured, and beyond recognition. You might wonder if it's even worth trying to fix, or if it's simply destined to remain in pieces. But what if I told you that the very process of mending that pottery could reveal something far more beautiful than its original form? What if, in its brokenness, it could be transformed into something even more valuable than it was before? Today I want to talk to you about a journey of restoration, redemption, and hope. There are moments in life when we feel as though our dreams have been shattered, our purpose lost, or our hearts irreparably broken. We struggle, we grieve, and we ask ourselves, can I ever be whole again? The truth is, there is a divine power at work in every brokenness, a power that not only heals, but transforms. Our pain, our lost years, our broken dreams, God has the ability to take all of that and restore it in ways beyond our comprehension. As we go through this journey together today, I invite you to open your hearts and minds to the possibility that, no matter where you've been or what you've lost, God is in the business of making all things new. He is in the process of taking what is broken and turning it into something beautiful, not just for us, but through us. By the end of this message, I hope you will see your struggles in a new light and feel empowered to embrace the restoration that is waiting for you. So, I ask you to stay with me throughout this message, to let the words resonate deep within your soul, and to remember that God's power to restore is far greater than any hardship you may face. Let's begin this journey of transformation together. Time, in the way we understand it, is linear. It moves forward 1 second after another through the ticking of clocks and the passing of days, months, and years. It is a force we cannot stop or reverse, and for most of us, it's a finite resource. We measure our lives by time, how old we are, how many years we've lived, how much time we have left to accomplish our goals. Time governs our lives in ways that often leave us feeling as though we are racing against it, struggling to make up for lost moments, missed opportunities, and unfulfilled dreams. In this earthly understanding of time, there is a constant feeling that we are losing, that time is slipping away faster than we can hold on. But God, in His essence, exists outside of this understanding of time. To God, time is not a linear progression, but rather an eternal now. He is not bound by the ticking of a clock or the limitations that we experience. While we measure our lives by years, God sees the beginning, the middle, and the end all at once. What we perceive as the loss of time, whether it's a lost year, a broken dream, or a missed opportunity, does not escape God's view. He is the one who created time, and He holds all of it in His hands, not subject to its passing as we are. This truth should be a source of profound comfort. If God is not limited by time, He is able to reach into our past, our present, and our future, restoring what we thought was lost and redeeming what we thought was broken. The years we think were wasted, the dreams that seem to have evaporated, and the moments we cannot retrieve are all still within His grasp. God has the ability to take what seems lost to us and, in His eternal wisdom, transform it into something greater than we could ever imagine. We often view the passage of time with a sense of regret, wishing we could turn back the clock to undo mistakes or reclaim lost opportunities. But the concept of time, as seen through God's eyes, shows us that no time is truly lost in His economy. Even what seems to be wasted time can be redeemed. Through His power, He can take the years we feel we've squandered and use them to prepare us for something far beyond what we had planned. God is not bound by the ticking of time. He works within time, yet He also transcends it. When we place our trust in God's sovereignty over time, we begin to understand that He can redeem the years we feel were stolen from us. In fact, He can use them to build us into the people He desires us to be. We may not be able to see how God is working in the moment, but His ability to restore lost time is not confined by our understanding of the past or our limited view of the future. With God, every moment is precious, and He can bring good out of every season of life, no matter how difficult or seemingly wasted. His work in us is not constrained by time. It is always purposeful, always redemptive, and always working toward His greater plan. Life, as we know it, is far from perfect. It is marked by a reality of brokenness, pain, and suffering, much of which can stem from our own mistakes, the mistakes of others, or the simple harshness of living in a fallen world. The concept of the fall, both in the biblical sense and in the practical sense, is a powerful reminder that human life is not as it was originally intended to be. We experience a world where dreams are shattered, relationships are fractured, and hopes are dashed. The reality of human life is often one of deep disappointment, leading us to question our worth, purpose, and even the fairness of existence itself. Dreams that once seemed attainable become distant, or worse, seem entirely out of reach. Yet in the midst of this brokenness, the story of God's redemptive power begins to unfold. It's easy, when we are in the thick of our suffering and loss, to see it as permanent or insurmountable. It is easy to feel that we are trapped in a cycle of disappointment that cannot be broken. Our broken dreams feel like a permanent scar on our life's journey, and it can be hard to imagine anything good coming from them. But this is where God's restorative power comes into play. The fallenness of life, while it brings suffering, is not the final word. It is not the end of the story. In fact, it is the beginning of a much greater narrative, the narrative of redemption. While we are bound to experience brokenness in this life, God is not content to leave us in that brokenness. He is constantly at work to heal and restore, not just the surface of our lives, but the very core of our being. In the moments when we feel most defeated, God is working behind the scenes to make all things new. He is bringing beauty out of ashes, hope out of despair, and strength out of weakness. Restoration does not always happen immediately, nor does it always take the form we expect. The process of restoration is not simply about fixing what's broken on the outside. It's about an internal transformation that leads to wholeness. God uses the very brokenness of our lives to refine and shape us into something greater. In this process, we discover that our pain, rather than being something that defines us, becomes something that God uses to bring us closer to Him, to teach us, and to mold us into the people we are meant to be. One of the key aspects of this restoration is recognizing that it is not about returning to what was, but about becoming something new. We may never fully understand why certain things happened or why certain dreams were never realized, but we can trust that God is making something far better out of those lost years and broken dreams. Through His redemptive power, we are being transformed from the inside out. Our wounds, instead of being permanent marks of failure, become the very places where God's grace is most evident. And in the end, we find that our brokenness becomes a testament to God's ability to restore what was thought to be lost forever. At the heart of the Christian faith is the understanding that God has a plan for every life, a plan that is both good and purposeful. This plan is not just a vague notion or a distant ideal. It is a personal, intimate journey that God intricately designs for each individual, even when we are unaware of it. Often we face times in life when we feel disconnected from any sense of purpose or direction, especially during periods of loss, failure, or confusion. When dreams seem shattered and the future appears uncertain, it is easy to question whether there is any deeper meaning behind the events unfolding in our lives. But the truth is, God's redemptive plan is at work, even when we cannot see it, even when everything around us seems to be falling apart. God's plan for us is not merely about the achievement of personal goals or the fulfillment of our own desires. It is about His larger, eternal purpose, one that transcends our understanding and uses both the joyful and painful parts of our lives to shape us for something greater. There are times in life when we may not feel that we are on the path God has set for us. We may face seasons of doubt, failure, or even suffering, but it is during these moments that God is working most deeply, refining us for what He has prepared. Even in the midst of hardship, God is orchestrating events, shaping our hearts, and preparing us for the next stage of His divine plan. One of the key elements of God's redemptive plan is that it often does not look like we expect it to. We might assume that God's plan is a smooth path to success, but often it is through the valleys of disappointment and struggle that we are brought closer to Him. The moments of confusion and heartache are not signs of God's absence, but rather opportunities for His transformative work to take root in our hearts. These experiences are where we are most likely to learn about His character, to discover our own weaknesses, and to find new strength in Him. Throughout Scripture, we see examples of people whose lives seemed far from aligning with God's perfect plan, yet Grace is often understood in terms of forgiveness, the unmerited favor that God extends to humanity despite our imperfections and shortcomings. But grace, in its full richness, goes beyond mere forgiveness. It is also about restoration. While forgiveness frees us from the consequences of sin, grace empowers us to rebuild what was once broken. It is through grace that God restores what has been lost, whether that is the sense of peace, the joy of hope, or the dreams that have been shattered. Grace doesn't simply erase the scars of our mistakes and pain. It uses them as the very means of healing and transformation. When we experience loss or disappointment, it is easy to feel as though we are forever defined by those moments. We can become consumed by guilt, shame, or regret, and the weight of past mistakes or unfulfilled dreams may cloud our vision of the future. But grace speaks into this darkness with a powerful message. You are not defined by your failures. You are not doomed to live forever with the consequences of the years you feel were wasted or the dreams that were crushed. Grace opens the door for healing and renewal, offering a new way forward. This restoration through grace is not just about returning to the way things were before. It is about God taking what was broken and making it whole in a new and better way. It is through grace that God gives us the opportunity to rebuild and renew not just our circumstances, but our very hearts. The pain we've endured, the years we've lost, and the dreams that never came to fruition, these are all part of our story, but they are not the final chapter. Grace takes those broken places and breathes new life into them, often creating something far greater than what we had envisioned in the first place. The beauty of grace is that it is never earned. It is given freely, often in the most unexpected ways. We may feel as though we do not deserve to be restored, that our failures are too great, our mistakes too deep, but grace operates outside of what we deserve. It is God's gift to us, offered freely and abundantly. When we can accept this grace, we open ourselves up to the possibility of restoration, even in the most hopeless situations. When we can accept this grace, we open ourselves up to the possibility of restoration, even in the most hopeless situations. What grace does is transform us from the inside out. It does not simply patch up the broken parts of our lives and leave us as we were. It molds us into something stronger, more resilient, and more compassionate. When God extends His grace, it is not a passive act, but a powerful, transformative force that reorients our hearts, refines our character, and restores our relationship with Him. Through grace, the years that seemed lost become a testimony of God's ability to bring good out of pain. The dreams that were broken can be reborn in ways we never imagined. It is grace that redeems our past and gives us the strength to face the future with renewed hope and purpose. Grace, then, is not only the key to forgiveness, but also the catalyst for restoration. It is through grace that God heals our wounds, restores our dreams, and makes whole what was once broken. Waiting is a universal experience, and for many it is a season of frustration, uncertainty, and even despair. We live in a world that values instant results and immediate gratification. Whether it's waiting for a dream to come true, for healing from a hurt, or for the restoration of lost opportunities, waiting can often feel like a waste of time. We ask questions like, "Why is this taking so long?" Or, "Why is nothing happening?" During these times, it's easy to grow disheartened and even question God's plan. But in reality, waiting is not wasted time. It is, in fact, an essential part of God's redemptive process, a process that prepares us for what He is about to do in our lives. When we are in a season of waiting, it may seem as though nothing is happening, that life is on hold, and that the dreams we once held so dearly are slipping further away. It's easy to feel as though we are stuck in a holding pattern, as if the clock is ticking, but nothing is progressing. However, God uses these periods of waiting to shape us, to prepare our hearts, and to refine our character. What may feel like inactivity is actually a time of deep work. Work that we may not always be aware of, but work that is necessary for our growth and for the realization of His plan. 3. In the Bible, we see many examples of individuals who had to wait for God's timing. Abraham waited for decades for the fulfillment of God's promise to give him a son. Joseph spent years in prison before he saw the fruition of his dreams. David waited patiently for God's timing to make him king, even though he was anointed many years before he sat on the throne. In each of these cases, their waiting was not in vain. It was during these seasons of waiting that God was preparing them for the greater purpose He had in store. Waiting in God's hands is never a passive activity. It is a season of active preparation. During this time, God works in our hearts, teaching us to trust in His timing and to rely on His faithfulness. Waiting allows us to develop patience, perseverance, and a deeper faith. It is through waiting that we often learn the most about God's character, His goodness, His timing, and His faithfulness. Waiting is also a time of reflection and surrender. It requires us to let go of our own timelines and expectations and to trust that God knows what is best for us." End quote. Furthermore, waiting often leads to a greater appreciation for what we are waiting for. When we rush through life, we sometimes miss the deeper meaning behind the process, but waiting allows us to see more clearly what God is doing in our lives, and it gives us the opportunity to align our hearts with His will. It is a season that can bring us closer to Him, deepening our relationship and making us more attuned to His voice. In the end, waiting is not a waste of time. It is a purposeful part of God's plan to restore, redeem, and fulfill His promises in our lives. What seems like an unproductive pause is actually the groundwork for what is to come. In the fullness of time, when the waiting is over, we often discover that God has been working in ways we could not have understood during the process, bringing about something far greater than we could have imagined. Restoration is not merely about returning to a previous state. It is about transformation. Often, when we experience loss or pain, our natural inclination is to wish for things to go back to how they were before. The life we knew, the dreams we had, the sense of normalcy we once enjoyed. We long for the comfort of what was, hoping that the broken pieces of our lives can be pieced back together exactly as they were. However, God's concept of restoration is far more profound. It is not simply about returning to what was. It is about becoming something new, something better, and something more aligned with His purpose for us. When we go through hardship, loss, or disappointment, we often think of restoration as a way of recovering the past, getting back to where we were before the loss occurred. But God, in His wisdom and love, doesn't always work in ways that restore the past. Instead, He uses those very losses and broken moments to transform us into something stronger, more refined, and more attuned to His will. The healing God offers is not a simple mending of wounds. It is a deep and transformative process that changes us from the inside out. It's about God taking our brokenness and using it to create something that reflects His glory more fully. This kind of transformation may not always be easy. It involves surrender, trust, and a willingness to allow God to do the work He needs to do in us. It requires us to let go of our own plans and expectations for restoration, and to embrace the process that God has set before us. In times of difficulty, we may resist change or fear that we won't be the same person we once were. But in reality, we are not meant to be the same. Through God's restorative work, we become the person He always intended us to be, shaped and strengthened by the experiences we have endured. The beauty of this transformation is that it is never about losing our identity or becoming something unrecognizable. Rather, it is about God's refining process, which brings out the best version of ourselves. Just as a potter molds clay, God shapes us through the fires of life, molding us into vessels that are more useful and more reflective of His love and power. The process may involve pain, but it is a necessary part of becoming the person God created us to be. This transformation often results in a deeper sense of purpose. When we allow God to restore us in this way, we find that the things that once seemed important to us, things that we thought defined us, begin to fade in comparison to the greater calling God has for our lives. Our hearts are more aligned with His, and our perspectives are changed. We are no longer focused solely on what was lost, but on what God is doing in us and through us. Restoration, then, is not about returning to a past version of ourselves. It is about being transformed into a new creation, one that is better equipped to fulfill the purpose God has for us. In the end, the restoration God offers is far greater than simply restoring what was lost. It is about making us whole in a way that we could never have imagined on our own, using our brokenness to bring about something more beautiful than we ever thought possible. When dreams are shattered, when hope fades, and when the future feels uncertain, it is easy to lose sight of the possibility of restoration. Broken dreams often lead to broken hearts, leaving us feeling lost, abandoned, or even betrayed by life itself. It's in these moments of deep despair that our hope can seem like a distant memory, buried beneath layers of disappointment and fear. Yet it is precisely in these dark moments that God's power to restore hope shines brightest. Restoration of hope is not just about regaining the optimism we once had. It is about experiencing a renewed sense of trust in God's promises, no matter the circumstances. Hope is often fragile, especially when it is tied to our own plans, desires, or expectations. When our dreams don't unfold the way we had envisioned, it can feel as though hope itself has been lost. We can be tempted to believe that our dreams were unrealistic or that they were never meant to come true. This loss of hope can be crushing, and it can seem impossible to see a way forward. but God specializes in bringing hope where none seems to exist. Through His grace and love, He restores hope by reminding us of His sovereignty, His faithfulness, and His ability to make something beautiful out of what we once thought was broken beyond repair. Restoring hope does not necessarily mean that everything will turn out the way we had originally planned, but it does mean that we can trust God in the midst of our disappointment. He has the power to take our broken dreams and redirect them according to His perfect will. Sometimes the restoration of hope comes not through the fulfillment of our specific desires, but through the realization that God has something even better in store for us. It's about shifting our perspective from what we have lost to what God is still doing in our lives. Even when we cannot see the way ahead, hope is restored when we choose to trust in the goodness and faithfulness of God, knowing that He will never leave us or forsake us. This restoration of hope often requires patience. It is not an instantaneous process, but a journey of learning to wait and trust in God's timing. During this time, God is working in our hearts, teaching us to surrender our own plans and desires to Him. He is cultivating in us a hope that is rooted not in our circumstances, but in His unchanging nature. This kind of hope is not dependent on whether our circumstances improve immediately, but is anchored in the deep assurance that God is at work in our lives, even when we cannot see the full picture. Ultimately, the restoration of hope brings with it a renewed sense of purpose and expectation. It allows us to move forward, not with the same dreams we once had, but with a greater trust that God has a plan for us that is good and full of promise. As we allow God to restore our hope, we find that our dreams are no longer the center of our lives. Instead, it is God's will, His purpose, and His promises that become the foundation for our future. In this way, the restoration of hope leads us not just back to where we were, but forward into a deeper, more vibrant relationship with God, grounded in the assurance that He is always at work, even when we cannot yet see the results. The beauty of redemption is that it doesn't just repair what was lost or broken, it transforms it into something entirely new. Redemption is not merely about fixing a problem or restoring a previous state. It is about taking something that was marred or tarnished and making it into something more valuable and beautiful. In this way, God's ability to redeem is far beyond our human understanding of restoration. Redemption goes beyond the surface, reaching into the deepest parts of our lives, healing them and making them whole. The brokenness we experience, whether from pain, mistakes, or loss, becomes the very avenue through which God's redemptive power shines. When we think of redemption, we often think of it in terms of salvation or forgiveness, which is absolutely true. God redeems us through Christ, forgiving us and giving us new life. However, redemption also extends beyond our initial salvation to encompass every aspect of our lives. It is a continuous process where God takes the fractured parts of our lives, our hearts, our dreams, our relationships, and reworks them into something that reflects His glory. What may have once seemed hopeless, what we may have considered unworthy of redemption, is not beyond God's reach. He takes our past, our mistakes, and even our most painful moments, and He redeems them for His purposes. The beauty of redemption lies in the way God uses the very brokenness of our lives to bring about something more beautiful. We may look at our past, see the scars, and feel as though we are forever defined by what we have gone through. But in the hands of God, those very scars become a testimony of His grace and love. What seemed like a waste or a failure can become the backdrop for a story of redemption, where the darkness of the past makes the light of God's healing even more radiant. It is in this process of redemption that we find true healing, not just a mending of wounds, but a complete transformation that makes us more whole, more aligned with God's purpose, and more attuned to His love. This redemption also involves a shift in perspective. We begin to see the broken parts of our lives not as barriers, but as opportunities for God's glory to be revealed. Our weaknesses and failures, once seen as signs of our inadequacy, are now the very places where God's strength shines the brightest. In His redemptive work, God doesn't just erase our past, He uses it, refines it, and redeems it, turning what was meant for harm into something that serves a higher purpose. The beauty of redemption is that it doesn't just restore what was, but transforms it into something greater, something that can be used for good and for God's glory. Redemption is also about hope. It reminds us that no situation, no matter how broken, is beyond God's ability to redeem. It assures us that no matter how much we have lost, there is always the possibility of restoration, of a new beginning. God's redemptive power is limitless, and it is available to us in every moment of our lives. Whether we are experiencing pain, loss, or disappointment, we can trust that God is working to bring beauty from the ashes and to redeem all that has been lost. The beauty of redemption is that it doesn't just make us whole, it makes us new, in a way that only God can accomplish. One of the most profound aspects of God's restoration is the realization that, through His power, our deepest wounds can become the very places where we experience His greatest healing and transformation. Often when we go through seasons of loss, suffering, or failure, we see those experiences as permanent marks of our brokenness. We may feel that the pain we've endured defines us, or that we are forever tainted by what has happened. However, God does not waste our pain. He does not let our suffering go unnoticed. Instead, He uses these very wounds to bring about something good, something redemptive. Through God's grace, our wounds can become the places where His glory is most powerfully displayed. This process of turning wounds into places of strength is not easy. It requires vulnerability, trust, and a willingness to allow God into the deepest parts of our hearts. Often, the instinct is to hide our wounds, to cover them up, or to deny their existence altogether. We may feel ashamed of our struggles, or afraid that others will judge us for our pain. But God invites us to bring our brokenness to Him, knowing that He is not repelled by it. In fact, He is drawn to it, because it is through our weaknesses that His strength is most evident. God is in the business of taking what seems unfixable and turning it into something powerful. He can take our deepest scars and transform them into sources of hope for others. The wounds we carry, whether they are emotional, physical, or spiritual, have the potential to become the very instruments through which God does His most beautiful work. Through these wounds, we can come to know God in a deeper, more intimate way. We experience His comfort, His healing, and His presence in a manner that we could not if we were never broken. Our wounds become places where we learn to depend on God, to lean into His strength rather than our own, and to trust in His ability to heal and restore. The very pain that once seemed unbearable becomes the pathway to a stronger, more resilient faith. Moreover, as we experience healing in our own lives, we are often able to minister to others who are going through similar struggles. The wounds we once thought would define us can become the testimony of God's redemptive power. Our healed wounds are no longer just scars. They are symbols of God's faithfulness, and they offer hope to those who feel as though they are too broken to be healed. God uses our restored lives to reflect His glory and to show others that no wound is beyond His ability to heal. In this way, our wounds not only bring us closer to God, but they also allow us to be conduits of His healing to others. Through God's work, our brokenness does not have to be the end of the story. In fact, it often becomes the beginning of something new. Our wounds, instead of being marks of failure, become places where God's grace and power are most clearly seen. The beauty of God's restoration is that He can take what is broken and make it whole again, using even our deepest wounds to bring about His redemptive purposes. Forgiveness is often seen as an act that releases someone else from the consequences of their actions, but it is also a key element of God's restorative work in our own hearts. When we are wronged or hurt, it is natural to feel anger, resentment, and a desire for justice. We may hold on to these feelings, thinking that by doing so, we are somehow gaining control or making the other person pay for their actions. However, holding on to unforgiveness only serves to keep us trapped in the pain of the past, preventing us from experiencing the fullness of restoration that God wants to bring into our lives. Forgiveness is not about excusing the wrongdoing or pretending it didn't hurt. It is about releasing the hold that the offense has over our hearts, allowing God to heal the wounds and setting us free to move forward. When we forgive, we allow God's redemptive power to work in us. Forgiveness is an act of surrender, where we choose to release the debt that has been created by someone else's actions. It's a recognition that we cannot carry the burden of resentment and bitterness on our own, and that the weight of unforgiveness is too heavy for us to bear. In forgiving others, we allow God to take that burden from us, transforming our pain into a testimony of His grace. We are not forgiving because the other person deserves it. We are forgiving because we recognize that God has forgiven us, and in turn we are called to extend that same grace to others. Forgiveness is often the first step in the process of restoration. When we hold on to unforgiveness, we are not just holding on to the offense, but also locking ourselves in a cycle of pain and bitterness. Forgiveness breaks that cycle. It doesn't mean that everything goes back to how it was before the hurt occurred, nor does it necessarily mean that the relationship will be restored in the same way. It enables us to move forward, reducing the painful bias and barrier that hides the hurt in the first place. But it does mean that we are no longer allowing the offense to define us or control our actions. We are free from the bitterness and anger that holds us hostage. In this freedom, God can begin to heal us, allowing us to move forward in His peace. This process of forgiving is not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. It is a journey that requires humility, grace, and often time. But as we choose to forgive, we open the door for God to heal the deepest parts of our hearts. We stop viewing ourselves as victims of the wrongs done to us and start to see ourselves as recipients of God's grace. Through forgiveness, we find a freedom that cannot be achieved by holding on to anger and resentment. We also find that as we extend grace to others, we are more deeply aware of the grace God has shown us, and we grow in our ability to live in His love. Ultimately, forgiveness is an essential part of the restoration process. It is through forgiving others that we allow God to heal our broken hearts, remove the chains of bitterness, and restore peace to our souls. Forgiveness does not undo the wrong, but it frees us from its grip and enables God to bring new life and healing to the areas where we have been wounded. It is a powerful act of faith that allows God's restorative power to transform not only our hearts, but our entire perspective on life. One of the most powerful aspects of God's restorative work in our lives is the understanding that healing and restoration often come through the process of forgiving others. Forgiveness is an act that can seem impossible at times, especially when we are deeply hurt or betrayed. We may feel that holding on to anger or resentment is a way to protect ourselves or to make the offender pay for the pain they have caused. However, the truth is that unforgiveness only keeps us trapped in the past, preventing us from experiencing the fullness of healing and restoration that God offers.